Somewhere in the north, on a cold and moonlit sea, a ship is moving through the dark. It makes almost no sound at all. Its hull is long and low and shallow, built of overlapping oak planks that flex and breathe with every swell, and at its prow a carved dragon lifts its head against the stars. There are men along its benches, and their oars go into the water without splashing, because they have done this since they were children. Let the room grow quiet around you, and let the fire burn low, and let me tell you the whole story of the people who built that ship, where they came from, why they came, and what they left behind when at last the northern sea grew quiet again. For nearly 300 years, from the last decade of the 8th century to the middle of the 11th, these people would be the terror of Europe. They would also be its merchants, its settlers, its explorers, its mercenaries, and in the end its kings and its bishops. They came out of a corner of the world that the rest of Europe had barely thought about, and for 3 centuries almost nothing that happened on the coasts of the continent happened without them. History has given them a single name, and it is a name that they themselves would barely have recognized: the Vikings. It begins in a hard and beautiful country, the long, broken coast of Scandinavia, where the mountains fall straight into black water, where the fjords cut 100 miles inland between walls of rock, and where in winter the sun becomes a rumor that the old people talk about. It is a country of edges. Edges of water, edges of stone, thin green shelves of grass between the two. Almost nothing about it encourages anybody to stay put, and almost everything about it teaches a child to handle a boat. It begins with farms. Small houses of turf and timber scattered along the water, each with its few thin fields of barley, its cattle, its byre, its boat pulled up on the shingle. Not a nation, not an empire, not a city anywhere. A scattering of families living on the northern edge of the habitable world, growing a little more numerous with every generation, on land that could not be made any larger no matter how hard anybody worked. That arithmetic is the quiet engine underneath everything that follows. It begins with a boat, and this, above all else, is where it truly begins. In the workshops of the North, over many quiet centuries, men learned to build a vessel unlike anything else afloat anywhere in the world. Light enough that its own crew could carry it overland, strong and flexible enough to cross an open ocean, and shallow enough in the water to sail up a river into the middle of a kingdom that had never thought of itself as coastal at all. It begins on a summer morning in the year 793, on a small green island off the coast of northern England, where monks had been singing the hours for a century and a half, and where the sea, which had always been the safe road, the road that brought pilgrims and books and bishops, abruptly became something else. There is a moment in that morning when a man on the shore looked up, saw sails he did not recognize, and had perhaps a quarter of an hour left in which the world still made sense. It begins with the gods they carried in their heads. One-eyed Odin, who hanged himself on a windswept tree and stabbed himself with his own spear to win the secret of writing. Red-bearded Thor, whose hammer was the thunder and who was the god the ordinary farmer actually prayed to. And beneath everything a great ash tree whose roots held the worlds together, and at whose foot sat 3 silent women, weaving and cutting the fate of every living thing, gods included. And it begins with a promise that shaped how these people lived and, more importantly, how they were willing to die. That those who fell fighting would be chosen from the field and carried up to a hall roofed with shields, where the doors were counted in hundreds, and where the fallen would feast and fight and be healed and feast again, every day, until the last morning of the world. A morning which they were quite certain was coming, and which the gods themselves would not survive. They came down on the monasteries first, because the monasteries were rich and undefended and standing conveniently close to the water. Then, when the coasts had learned to hide their treasures, they came up the rivers instead, the Seine and the Loire, the Shannon and the Liffey, the Thames and the Ouse, rowing inland for days on end, until there was hardly a settlement in Western Europe far enough from water to sleep soundly in the summer months. But raiding is only the beginning of this story, and in the end it is the smallest part of it. Within 2 generations they had stopped merely taking things and begun to stay, plowing English fields, founding the first cities Ireland had ever had, taking Frankish land and marrying Frankish wives, until half of England lived under their law and spoke a language visibly bending toward theirs. The word for what they did changes somewhere in the 9th century, from raid to migration. They sailed west into water that no one had charted and nobody had promised held anything, and they found an empty island of fire and ice at the edge of the map, and they made a country on it. And the country they made had no king at all, only an assembly of free men who met once a year on a plain of black rock beneath a cliff, and listened while one man with a very good memory recited the law aloud so that nobody could claim not to have heard it. And they went further west still, first to a frozen coast that a convicted killer hopefully named the Greenland in order to sell it, and then beyond that across another stretch of open ocean, to a shore of wild grapes and tall timber and rivers so full of salmon that the sagas complain about it. They reached America 5 centuries before Columbus was born, built houses there, smelted iron there, and then, quietly and without any drama at all, let it go. Others turned east instead, and this is the half of the story that usually gets left out. They pushed their shallow boats up the great rivers of the Russian forests, hauling them bodily overland between one river system and the next, and came out at last on the Black Sea, founding, along the way, the trading towns that would become Novgorod and Kyiv, and giving their name, most probably, to a country that still carries a version of it. And some sailed on to the greatest city on earth, Constantinople, which they called simply the Great City. 12 miles of walls, several 100,000 people, aqueducts and silk markets, and a dome that seemed to float on light. They attacked it, failed, traded with it, grew rich on it, and finally were hired by it. The Emperor of the Romans came to trust northern axemen at his back more than he trusted his own countrymen, and made them his personal guard. Then slowly it ended. Not in one battle and not on one day, but through a long change that nobody at the time would have recognized as an ending. Kings grew stronger and squeezed out the independent chieftains. Churches went up where the old halls had stood. The raiders became lords and then Christians and then bishops. The silver from the east stopped arriving. And one summer, on some coast that had watched the horizon for 200 years, the ships simply did not come. This is that whole story told slowly, from the first strange sail on the horizon to the last northern king dying in an English field with an arrow in his throat. 3 centuries of raiders and farmers, poets and slavers, lawyers and navigators. There will be a great deal of it, and there is no need to remember any of it, and nothing at the end will be asked of you. Just let the sea carry you, and if you fall asleep in the middle, the ship will keep going without you. To understand why they left, you have to understand what they were leaving, and the honest answer is that they were leaving one of the least forgiving corners of Europe. Scandinavia is not one country but three quite different regions, and the differences between them shaped the whole age, because the Norwegians, the Danes, and the Swedes each went in a different direction, for reasons that were written into the ground beneath their feet long before anyone raised a sail. In the west lay Norway, and even the name is a description, the North Way, the sea road. It is a country that is mostly mountain and almost entirely edge. Its coastline, if you followed every inlet, would run for tens of thousands of miles, folded into fjords so deep and so narrow that the cliffs drop sheer into water hundreds of feet deep. Farmland exists only as thin green shelves between the rock and the sea, and there is never very much of it. A Norwegian farm in the 9th century might hold 20 people and 40 animals and no road whatsoever. To visit a neighbor, you took a boat. To trade, to marry, to bury your dead, to bring in hay from an outlying meadow, to go to war, you took a boat. From the time a child could walk, that child understood tides and wind and the behavior of a hull in a swell the way an inland farming people understand soil. It was not an interest. It was the condition of being alive there. In the east lay Sweden, gentler country, deep forest threaded with lakes and slow rivers, its face turned not toward the wild Atlantic but toward the enclosed and comparatively calm Baltic. And beyond the Baltic, across a short stretch of water, lay the mouths of rivers that ran south for thousands of miles into a continent full of furs and honey and silver. Where a Norwegian looked out and saw an ocean to be crossed, a Swede looked out and saw a road to be followed. And in the south lay Denmark, low, flat, comparatively fertile, a peninsula and a scatter of islands, with the best farmland in Scandinavia and the shortest distance to everywhere that mattered. Denmark was close enough to the Frankish Empire and to England to feel both their wealth and their weight, and it developed kings earlier and more effectively than either of its neighbors, because it had to. Danish history is largely the history of a small rich country living next door to a very large one. Over all three lay the winter, and the winter is the fact that organizes everything else. In the far north, the sun does not clear the horizon for weeks together. Even in Denmark, midwinter daylight is a gray handful of hours between two darknesses. Everything a household would eat between October and April had to be gathered, salted, dried, smoked, soured, or brewed before the cold arrived, and a miscalculation in September was not inconvenient in February. It was fatal. So the year had a shape, and the shape was strict. Spring, plowing, lambing, mending everything the winter had broken. Summer, the short, furious growing season, the hay, the fishing, and, for those who chose it, the sailing season, because the same months that were good for grass were the only months that were safe on the water. Autumn, the slaughter, the salting, the storing, the brewing. Winter, the long dark inside a smoky hall, spinning and carving and waiting, and telling stories because there was nothing else to do. And into this narrow, carefully balanced economy came a problem that no amount of hard work could solve. The population was rising. Perhaps it was better iron and better plows. Perhaps it was a spell of warmer centuries that pushed the growing season a little further north. Perhaps it was simply time. Whatever the cause, by the 8th century there were more young men in Scandinavia each generation than there was land on which to settle them, and there was no more land to be had. Worse, in much of the north the custom was that a farm passed whole and undivided to a single heir, and there was hard sense in that. Split a marginal holding between 3 sons, and within 2 generations you have 3 families starving instead of 1 family surviving. But it also meant that every second son and every third son grew up in a house he already knew would never be his, understanding from boyhood that whatever life he was going to have would have to be built somewhere over the water. Now put the pieces together. Take a young man with no inheritance and no prospects and a great deal of pride. Give him a fast ship and a coastline of undefended wealth 4 days' sail away, and a religion which teaches that fate is fixed anyway, and that the only thing a man controls is whether he is spoken of well afterwards. You do not need to look much further than that for the origins of the Viking Age. The land made these people, and then it had no room for them. They did not appear out of nowhere in 793, however much it felt that way to the people they landed on. The North had been quietly busy for thousands of years before that morning, and the men who came ashore at Lindisfarne carried with them a culture that was already very old, already skilled, and already far better informed about the outside world than the outside world was about them. In the Bronze Age, more than 1,000 years earlier, Scandinavia had been rich and thoroughly connected. It had one commodity that the Mediterranean wanted badly and could not get anywhere else: amber, the golden fossil resin that washes up on the Baltic shores, which traveled south along established routes all the way to Greece and Egypt, and which brought bronze back north in exchange. This was never an isolated place. It was the far end of a long road, and it knew it. And on flat glacier-scoured rocks across Sweden and Norway, those Bronze Age people carved pictures of what mattered to them, and what mattered to them, overwhelmingly, was ships. Long curved hulls crewed by rows of tiny stick figures, sometimes with the sun above them, sometimes with men holding their arms raised. 3,000 years before the Viking Age, this coast was already carving boats into stone. The obsession with the ship is older than anything else we know about them. Then came iron, and iron changed the balance of power in a way that bronze never had. Bronze needs copper and tin, which must be traded for. Iron in Scandinavia could be dug straight out of the ground by anybody. It occurred as bog iron, heavy red nodules that formed in the marshes and could be gathered by hand and smelted in a small clay furnace over charcoal. Any community with a bog, a wood, and patience could arm itself without asking anyone's permission. By the centuries after the Western Roman Empire came apart, the North had settled into the pattern that would still be there when the raids began: a landscape of chieftains. A man of standing held a hall, and in that hall he fed, housed, armed, and rewarded a body of young warriors who had attached themselves to him. He gave them meat and ale and arm rings and swords. They gave him loyalty, labor, and violence. That exchange was the entire basis of northern politics for 600 years. It is worth pausing on that word, hall, because it is not a castle and not a palace. It is a long timber building, sometimes well over 100 feet from end to end, with a fire trench running down the middle of the floor, benches along both walls, a high seat for the lord halfway down, and a roof held up by 2 rows of great posts. Warmth, food, drink, safety, company, story, and status all came from inside that one room, which is precisely why the man who controlled it controlled everything. The archaeology of the centuries immediately before the raids, the period Swedish scholars call the Vendel Age, shows us these chieftains in their graves, and they are not poor. They are buried with iron and bronze helmets decorated with tiny stamped scenes of warriors and animals, with pattern-welded swords whose blades were built from twisted rods of iron forged together, with shields and horses and hunting birds, and again with their boats. And the grave goods show something else, that this world was already plugged into the wider one. Frankish glass, weapons from the workshops of the Rhineland, garnets that had come from as far away as India or Sri Lanka, silver from further east, and local workshops turning out metalwork of genuine sophistication. These were not people who blundered accidentally into civilization in 793. They knew what lay to the south, roughly how it was defended, and approximately what it was worth. What they had lacked for a very long time was speed. The boats of the earlier centuries were superb, but they were rowed. A rowed vessel is excellent for the fjords and for crossing to the next valley, and it is limited by the endurance of its crew. It could not put 50 armed men on a foreign beach 400 miles away without warning, and until something could, the wealth of Britain and Frankia was safely out of reach. Then, sometime in the 8th century, the exact date is still argued over, and depends on when you think the mast and the woolen square sail were adopted in the north, that limitation disappeared. The moment a Scandinavian hull could carry sail properly, the distance from western Norway to the coast of Britain stopped being a formidable expedition and became a matter of 2 or 3 days with a fair wind. The whole arithmetic of the northern world changed at once. Everything about the Viking Age rests on the ship, so it is worth taking some time to understand exactly what these people had built and why it was so much better than anything else on the water. This is not a story about ferocity. Plenty of peoples were ferocious. This is a story about a piece of engineering that was 2 or 3 centuries ahead of everybody else, developed by trial and error on a coast where a bad boat killed you young. Start with the keel because everything else is built onto it. A single great timber, cut from one straight oak, running the entire length of the vessel like a spine, and shaped so that it projects a little below the line of the hull. That projection is what gives the ship its grip on the water, so that it can sail across the wind instead of only running before it, and it is also what takes the strain when the whole vessel is dragged bodily up a beach, which happened constantly. Then the planking, and here the northern method is genuinely different from the Mediterranean one. The Norse did not build a skeleton and then cover it. They built the shell first, plank upon plank, each one overlapping the one below it and fastened through with iron rivets clenched over small square plates on the inside. Only afterwards were light frames fitted into the finished shell to stiffen it. This is clinker building, and it produces a hull that is astonishingly light for its strength. And lightness matters because a hull that is light can also be allowed to flex. A Viking ship does not resist the sea. It moves with it. Watch a modern replica under sail in any kind of swell and you can see the whole vessel working. The planks sliding fractionally against one another, the hull visibly twisting along its length, the stem rising and falling out of line with the stern. It spills the force of the waves instead of absorbing it, which is why these ships survived weather that should have destroyed them. The planks themselves were not sawn. They were split, riven, radially out of a straight oak trunk with iron wedges and mallets, so that every board followed the natural grain of the timber rather than cutting across it. A riven plank is far stronger and far more resistant to water than a sawn one, and it can be worked down much thinner. It also means waste on a heroic scale. A single magnificent oak might yield only a couple of dozen usable boards, and one ship could consume a small wood. Into the seams between the planks went the caulking. Animal hair or loose wool, spun into a long cord, soaked in pine tar, and driven hard into the join before the rivets were closed. Over and around everything else went more tar, worked into the timber against rot and worm. A ship in service smelled overwhelmingly of pine tar and wet wool and salt, and the tar had to be renewed constantly, which meant that every fleet needed forests and kilns and men whose whole trade was burning pine roots slowly underground. Then the sail, and the sail was, in raw economic terms, very likely the most expensive single component of the whole vessel. A square sail of woolen cloth, sometimes woven in colored stripes or diamonds, its surface worked over with grease and tar until it was almost windproof. The wool for one large sail could take the fleeces of several hundred sheep, and the spinning and weaving of it could occupy a household's women for years, working through winter after winter. It is worth stopping on that because it inverts the usual picture. The Viking Age is remembered as an age of men, and the raiding certainly was. But the sail, without which not one of these voyages happens, not Lindisfarne, not Iceland, not Vinland, not Constantinople, was manufactured almost entirely by women, at the spindle and the upright loom in the dark half of the year. Every raid on every coast in Europe began, years earlier, with somebody's mother at a loom. Now put these elements together and consider what the finished machine could actually do. A large longship might be 70 or 80 feet long and only 9 or 10 feet in the beam, extraordinarily narrow, and might draw as little as 3 feet of water fully loaded. 3 feet. It could cross open ocean under sail with 60 men aboard, and then run straight up a shallow river, or simply onto a flat beach with no harbor, no pier, and no warning whatsoever. That is the entire secret of the age, and it is worth stating plainly. Every other seagoing vessel in Europe required a port to load and unload. The Norse ship required nothing at all. It could appear on any beach in the hours before dawn, put 50 armed men ashore, and be gone over the horizon before any defense could be organized. And it could sail 100 miles inland up a river to a town that had never once in its history considered itself to be reachable from the sea. They had more than one design, and the distinction matters more than people usually realize. The long, narrow, or heavy warship that the sagas call a longship was built for speed and for carrying men, and it is useless as a freighter. The broader, deeper, decked cargo vessel, the Nar, carried a small crew and a large hold, and relied on sail rather than oars. It was the Nar, not the longship, that crossed to Iceland and Greenland with families, sheep, seed corn, and iron tools aboard. And how did they navigate days out of sight of land? Not with a compass. That would not reach Europe for centuries yet. They used the height of the sun at midday, the pole star at night, the direction and rhythm of the ocean swell, the flight lines of seabirds going out at dawn and back at dusk, the color of the water, the shape of clouds standing over unseen land, and above all a memorized body of sailing lore. Hold this latitude, keep the star at this height above the rail, and in so many days you will raise a coast. It was not precise, and men died of its imprecision. The sagas record ships that simply never arrived, and others that made landfall 1,000 miles from where they intended. But it was good enough again and again to link Norway to Shetland, Shetland to the Faroes to Iceland, Iceland to Greenland, and Greenland at last to the coast of North America, the longest chain of repeated open-water navigation that anyone on Earth had yet managed. Off the coast of Northumbria, in the far northeast of England, there is a low green island that stops being an island twice a day. When the tide falls, a track of wet sand and mud emerges and joins it to the mainland, and you can walk across. When the tide rises, the sea closes over the track and the place is cut off again. The Anglo-Saxons called it Lindisfarne, and that rhythm of connection and isolation is precisely why holy men had wanted it. It had been sacred for a century and a half. A monastery had been founded there by Irish monks who came from Iona in the Scottish Isles, and by the 8th century it had grown into one of the great intellectual centers of Northern Europe, a place of scholarship and missionary work and manuscript production, connected by sea to Ireland, to Frankia, and to Rome, and utterly secure in the knowledge that the water around it was a road for friends. In its scriptorium, the monks had made the Lindisfarne Gospels, a book so intricate that the eye slides off its ornament and cannot follow the lines, its great initial letters wound about with birds and hounds and interlace, its pigments including a blue made from lapis lazuli that had come overland from Afghanistan. It is thought to be largely the work of one man, over years of his life, in a cold room by the North Sea. The monastery also held the shrine of St. Cuthbert, the most loved holy man in the north of England, and around that shrine had accumulated a century of royal generosity. Silver, gold, jeweled book covers, reliquaries, altar vessels, gifts from kings who wanted the saint's goodwill. In the most literal sense, it was a treasury. And it stood on an open beach entirely undefended, because for 150 years there had been no earthly reason to defend it. On the 8th of June, in the year 793, ships came in off the sea. There is no reason to think anyone on the island understood what they were looking at until it was much too late. We have no account from anybody who was actually there. What we have is the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, compiled later and written flatly, and one letter, and the letter is by far the more terrible document, because in it you can hear an intelligent man trying to fit something into a framework that has no room for it, and failing. Alcuin of York, the finest English scholar of his generation, was away at the court of Charlemagne when the news reached him. He wrote back to Northumbria in something close to disbelief. Never before, he said, had such a terror appeared in Britain as this that they had now suffered from a pagan people, nor was it thought possible that such an inroad from the sea could be made. He then, being a churchman of his time, told them it was their own fault for their luxury and their haircuts. But it is that one phrase that carries the shock of it, nor was it thought possible. The sea had been a boundary. The sea had been the safe side. Missionaries came from the sea and books came from the sea, and the tide came in and went out twice a day exactly as it always had. And now something had come out of it that nobody had planned for, and the holiest place in the north of England was lying open on its beach with its doors broken in. The raiders took what could be carried and burned or broke a good deal of what could not. Monks were killed at the altar. Some were drowned in the sea. Some, young and strong, were carried off to be sold, which was in every practical sense worse. The great gospel book survived, and Cuthbert's body survived, because somebody had the presence of mind to hide them or the luck to be overlooked. The sense of safety did not survive at all anywhere for 200 years. And then, this is the part that mattered most, the ships left. There was no army to bring to battle, no siege to break, no occupation to resist, nobody to negotiate with. There was a morning of violence and an empty beach by evening, and no possible way of striking back at people who were already over the horizon and would be home in Norway inside a week, dividing the silver. That is what made it new. Europe understood invasion perfectly well. It had centuries of practice. It did not understand this. Within 2 years, the same thing had happened at Jarrow, and at Iona in the west and along the coast of Ireland. The pattern was established, and for the next 200 years every monastery and every town within reach of navigable water would watch the summer sea with a particular kind of dread, and move its treasures inland in June. To understand the men in those ships, you have to understand what they believed was actually true about the world, and their world was not a comfortable one. It had a beginning, it had a shape, and unlike almost every other religion of the age, it had an end that was already fixed and already known, and the gods themselves were going to lose. Everything else in the northern imagination grows out of that one hard fact. At the center of everything stood a tree. Yggdrasil, the world ash, so vast that its branches held up the sky and its 3 great roots reached down into 3 separate worlds. A serpent gnawed continually at one root. A stag and 4 harts ate at its leaves. A squirrel ran up and down the trunk carrying insults between the eagle at the top and the serpent at the bottom. The universe, in Norse thought, was a living thing that was being slowly eaten from every direction at once. Around the tree lay the 9 worlds. Asgard of the gods, high up. Midgard, the middle enclosure, where human beings lived, ringed by an ocean and by a serpent so enormous that it circled the whole world and held its own tail in its mouth. Jotunheim of the giants, who were not merely large but older than the gods and permanently hostile. And below everything the cold, dim country of hell, where most of the dead, the ones who died of illness or age or accident, which is most people, simply went. And at the foot of the tree, beside a well sat 3 women. The Norns. They wove and measured and cut, and what they set could not be unset. They fixed the fate of gods and men alike, and not even Odin could argue with them. He could only try to find out what they had decided. This is the bedrock of the Norse mind, and it explains a great deal about their behavior. Your fate is already written, and the only thing left in your control is the manner in which you meet it. Odin was the chief of the gods, and he was not a reassuring figure. He was the god of poetry and of frenzy, of runes and of the gallows, of wisdom and of kings, clever, restless, devious, and frankly untrustworthy. A god who broke oaths when it suited him and who gave victory to men and then took it away again on a whim. He traded one of his eyes for a single drink from the well of wisdom, and he considered it a good bargain. And he hung himself on the world tree for 9 nights, wounded with his own spear, given, as the poem says, myself to myself, and stared down into the darkness until the runes rose up out of it to meet him. That is how writing came into the world, in the northern account, not as a gift, but as something wrenched out of the dark by a god willing to torture himself for 9 days to get it. Everything Odin has, he paid for. He kept 2 ravens called Thought and Memory, who flew out over the world every morning and came back at evening to whisper in his ear what they had seen. 2 wolves at his feet, to whom he gave all his food, and a gray horse with 8 legs that could ride over sea and air. And he collected the dead, sending his shield maidens, the Valkyries, the choosers of the slain, over the battlefields to select which of the fallen would be brought up to his hall. Thor was a different sort of god altogether, and Thor was the one the ordinary farmer actually prayed to. Red-bearded, enormously strong, hot-tempered, plain-spoken, and completely reliable. A god who drove a chariot pulled by 2 goats and killed giants with a short-handled hammer called Mjolnir. The thunder was the sound of his wheels. He was the defender of Midgard against the things outside it, and far more little hammer amulets survive in the ground than any other religious object of the entire age. There were others. Frey, who gave good harvests and peace and pleasure and fair weather, and whose statues embarrassed later Christian writers. His sister Freya, goddess of love and of war and of a strange shamanic magic called Cedar, who rode a chariot drawn by cats and who took half of the battle dead for her own hall. Odin did not get all of them. And Tyr, who put his hand into a wolf's mouth as a pledge that he and everyone else knew to be a lie, and lost it because somebody had to. And there was Loki, who is one of the strangest figures in any mythology, because he is neither a god nor an enemy but something necessary and corrosive in between. Clever, funny, malicious, endlessly resourceful, the one who causes the disaster and then usually solves it. Until at last he caused one that could not be solved, and the gods bound him under the earth with a serpent fixed above his face to drip venom on him, where he lies waiting for the end of the world with a very long memory. Because it was all going to end, and they knew how. Ragnarok, the doom of the powers. It was told plainly without hedging. First 3 winters running with no summer between them, and brothers killing brothers across the world for no reason anyone can name. Then the wolf swallows the sun and another wolf the moon. The world serpent rises out of the sea and the tide comes in over the land, and the dead sail to the battle in a ship built from the untrimmed fingernails of corpses. And on that morning the gods go out to fight and the gods lose. Odin is swallowed by the wolf Fenrir, having known for centuries that this was how it would happen and having spent those centuries gathering an army anyway. Thor kills the world serpent and then walks 9 paces and falls dead of its venom. The earth burns and sinks into the sea. This was not presented as a warning about what might happen if people behaved badly. It was simply what was going to happen. Which brings us back to the Hall of the Slain and to why it mattered so much. Valhalla was not a reward in the Christian sense, and Odin was not gathering warriors out of generosity or affection. He was recruiting for that last morning, and he knew perfectly well that the army would not be enough. To die well in battle was to be chosen for a war that had already been lost before it started, and to go and fight it anyway because that is what a person does. And that, far more than any raid or any hoard of silver, is the true shape of the northern mind, and it is worth carrying with you into sleep. Fate is fixed, the end is certain, the odds are terrible, and none of that is accepted as an excuse for anything. Cattle die, says one of their poems, and kinsmen die, and you yourself will die. But one thing never dies, the judgment passed on a man after he is gone. Live so that the verdict is a good one. So why 793 and not 2 centuries earlier or 2 centuries later? The North had ships and gods and landless young men for a very long time before that summer morning, and historians have been arguing about the trigger for the best part of 200 years. The honest answer, which is less satisfying than a single cause but far more likely, is that 4 or 5 separate things changed at roughly the same moment and reinforced each other. The first was the sailing ship, which we have already met. Whatever the precise decade, the mast and the woolen sail were fully adopted in the North, and the archaeology is frustratingly thin on this. The effect was to convert a skilled coastal people into an oceanic one inside 2 generations. It did not make them warlike. They were already that. It made distance cheap, and cheap distance changes everything about what a violent man can profitably attempt. The second was silver, and it came from an unexpected direction. Far to the east, the Islamic Caliphate was minting silver coin in enormous quantities, and that silver was moving north up the Russian river systems in exchange for the products of the northern forests: furs, honey, beeswax, walrus ivory, and slaves. Scandinavians found themselves sitting at the end of a river of money, and the reliable presence of money creates ambition, competition, and armed retinues. And silver in the North was not currency in our sense at all. It was weight and it was status. It was cut up, weighed on small folding balances, worn on the arm as rings that could be chopped apart to pay a debt, and buried in hoards under floors and beside field boundaries. A chieftain's power was measured not by what he kept but by what he could conspicuously give away, which meant that more silver arriving in the North meant larger retinues, and larger retinues need feeding, arming, and occupying. The third pressure was political, and it came from inside. Kings were consolidating, in Denmark first, where a recognizable royal power appears early, and then through the 9th century in Norway. And the process by which a king absorbs the independent chieftains around him always produces losers. Proud men with ships, followers, weapons, and suddenly nowhere at home where they are permitted to be proud. Every consolidation flung a certain number of such men out onto the water. The fourth was pressure from outside, and specifically from Charlemagne. Through the last decades of the 8th century, the Frankish emperor was conquering and forcibly converting the Saxons directly on Denmark's southern border. Mass deportations, the execution of those who refused baptism, decades of grinding war. To a Danish chieftain in the 780s, Christian empire was not a theological abstraction. It was a machine visibly working its way toward his frontier, and it did not stop. And the fifth was simple, undeniable opportunity. The monasteries of Britain and Ireland were, quite literally, the richest undefended buildings in Europe. They stood beside water because water was the road. They accumulated silver and gold because that is where the faithful gave it. They kept no soldiers and built no walls because for a century and a half nobody had needed to ask the question who would dare to rob God. In 793 somebody answered it. It is worth being clear about what the raiders were actually after, because treasure is only half of it, and the other half is usually hurried past. They wanted people. Slavery was fundamental both to the Norse domestic economy and to their trade with the East, and a captured monk or farmer or child was portable, durable, and in permanent demand in markets from Dublin to the Volga. A raid that took no silver but took 20 young captives was still a profitable raid. That is the uncomfortable center of the Viking Age, and it should not be sailed past politely. These people were extraordinary sailors, superb craftsmen, and genuinely gifted poets, and this story will spend a good deal of time admiring them. They were also, systematically and for profit over 3 centuries, slavers on a very large scale. A great deal of the silver in those beautiful twisted arm rings had been paid for, somewhere along the line, with somebody's stolen life. The word itself is oddly slippery. In Old Norse, to go Viking meant to go off on an expedition of exactly this kind. It describes an activity, not a people, rather as one might say to go fishing. Most Scandinavians of the period never went Viking at all in their lives. They farmed, fished, wove, forged, argued at assemblies, raised children and died within a few miles of the house they were born in, and the age is named after what a minority of them did in the summer. Their neighbors had their own names for them, and the variety tells you something. The Franks said Northmen, which is geography. The English said Danes, regardless of whether the men in question were Danish. The Irish annals carefully distinguish dark foreigners from fair foreigners, meaning different groups arriving from different directions. The Slavs and the Greeks and the Arabs said Rus or Varangians. Nobody in 9th century Europe was afraid of a thing called a Viking. They were afraid of a sail. The first phase, roughly the 50 years after Lindisfarne, followed one pattern nearly everywhere it happened: small numbers of ships, summer only, coastal or near-coastal targets, and home again before the autumn gales made the North Atlantic unsurvivable. It was seasonal work, fitted around the farming year, and a man might go out for 3 or 4 summers to raise the capital for a farm and a marriage and then never go again. Ireland took it worst and took it earliest. It was close to Norway by the northern route around Scotland. It was extraordinarily rich in portable church treasure, and it was politically divided into dozens of small kingdoms that had no mechanism for combining against a common threat. From 795 onward, the raids came almost annually, and the Irish annals record them in the flat, exhausted, one-line manner of people who have long since stopped being astonished by anything. There is a famous little poem scribbled by an Irish monk in the margin of a manuscript, in the middle of some quite different work. He is glad, he writes, that the wind is fierce tonight and the sea is white with it, because on such a night as this he need not fear the fierce warriors of Norway crossing the water to find him. It is a small thing, and it tells you exactly what it was like to live on that coast. Weather is mercy. Then, around the 830s, the character of the raids changed. The fleets got larger, dozens of ships rather than 3 or 4. They came earlier in the year and stayed later. And then they stopped going home at all. They began to overwinter, building fortified camps at river mouths and on defensible islands and simply remaining through the dark months, so that the next season's campaigning could begin in March at full strength instead of in June. That single innovation transformed the entire problem. A fleet that overwinters is no longer a raid at all. It is an occupying army with a supply base which can be reinforced from home, which can be joined by newcomers, and which can spend the winter negotiating with local rulers about who it is going to attack in the spring. Once the Norse discovered this, the scale of their operations increased by an order of magnitude within a decade. In Frankia, the rivers were the highways, and there were a great many of them. The Seine, the Loire, the Garonne, the Rhine, the Scheldt. Fleets rode inland for days at a time, using the current to leave and the tide to enter. Rouen was sacked. Nantes was sacked on a feast day with the cathedral full of people. Paris, then a modest town on its island in the Seine, was attacked and burned repeatedly, and besieged in earnest in 885. And the Franks, wealthy and organized but structurally slow to concentrate their forces against a fast-moving enemy, discovered a solution that worked beautifully in the short term and was catastrophic in the long. They paid. Enormous quantities of silver were handed over to persuade fleets to go somewhere else. It worked every time. It also advertised across the whole of the North, in the clearest possible terms, exactly how lucrative this line of business had become. The eventual answer was engineering rather than heroism. Fortified bridges were built low across the rivers specifically to stop ships passing. Towns raised walls and dug ditches. Charles the Bald ordered defended crossings at key points on the Seine, and though it took decades and a great deal of money, the effect was cumulative. By the end of the century, the great river expeditions had become slow, expensive, and dangerous, where once they had been quick and nearly free. They went south as well, and much further than is usually remembered. A fleet raided the Atlantic coast of Spain and was roughly handled by the fleets and armies of the Muslim rulers of Al-Andalus, who were considerably better organized than anyone the Norse had met so far. In the 860s, a large expedition pushed through the Strait of Gibraltar into the Mediterranean, raided North Africa and the Balearic Islands, sacked towns in southern France and Italy, and struggled home years later with a fraction of its ships. The picture that emerges from all of this is not a horde and not an invasion in the ordinary sense. It is an industry. Small mobile enterprises, ships pooling and dispersing according to opportunity, crews forming for a single season under a leader with a good reputation, splitting the profit at the end of it, and reforming somewhere else entirely the following spring. It was organized violence, run on very much the same principles as a fishing fleet. In the year 841, a Norse fleet came into the wide bay on Ireland's eastern coast, rowed a short way up a dark tidal river, and built a fortified ship camp, what the Irish called a long fort, at a place where a black pool lay at the meeting of two waters. In Irish, that black pool was Dublin. It was meant to be a base for the season's raiding. It became, instead, the thing none of them had intended: a city. Because Ireland at that date had no cities. It had monasteries, some of them very large. It had royal seats and cattle fairs and assembly places. But it had nothing that functioned as a permanent commercial town where goods could be stored, valued, and exchanged all year round. The Norse built one, not out of any civilizing impulse, but because men who take a great deal of property need somewhere reliable to convert it into silver. And what they mostly converted was people. Dublin became the largest slave market in Western Europe, a clearinghouse through which captives taken in Ireland, in Britain, in the Hebrides and beyond passed on their way to Scandinavia, to Al-Andalus and eastward. The town's early wealth rested on that trade with a directness that is difficult to look at. When we admire what Dublin became, we are admiring something built on the sale of human beings. Excavations beneath the modern city have uncovered the town they made in remarkable detail, preserved in wet ground. Streets of wattle-walled houses on fixed rectangular plots, rebuilt again and again on exactly the same boundaries over 200 years. Workshops for amber, bone, antler, leather, and silver, ship timbers reused as revetments, and the ordinary domestic rubbish of a crowded urban population. Property lines that stay put for 2 centuries are not the marks of a camp. They are the marks of a home. Other towns followed on precisely the same model: Waterford, Wexford, Cork, Limerick. Ireland's first cities are, with almost no exceptions, Norse foundations, and the country's urban geography still reflects it 1,000 years later. The invaders had brought with them the one thing the island genuinely lacked, and they brought it entirely by accident, in pursuit of something else. And the politics became local astonishingly fast. Within a single generation, the Sea Kings of Dublin were no longer foreign raiders but participants in Irish dynastic quarrels, hiring themselves out to one Irish king against another, marrying into Irish royal families, taking Irish names for their children, and feuding with the Norse of Limerick every bit as bitterly as with anyone else. By the 10th century, a Norse-Irish aristocracy existed that was not fully either thing. They also fought constantly across the Irish Sea, and here the story becomes genuinely tangled. The Kingdom of Dublin and the Norse Kingdom of York were repeatedly held by members of the same restless dynasty, and their leaders shuttled between Ireland and northern England for decades, gaining one when they lost the other. For a while, a single family was trying to run a maritime kingdom with its two halves separated by a sea and by a good deal of hostile territory. The names left behind show how deep the settlement went. Along the Irish coast, Wicklow, Waterford, Leixlip, which is simply the Salmon Leap. In the north and the Isles, Orkney and Shetland became Norse-speaking earldoms and stayed that way for 600 years. The Hebrides and the Isle of Man kept Norse law, Norse assemblies and Norse landholding long after the mainland had forgotten them. Half the map of the Irish Sea is still written in Old Norse. On the Isle of Man, the parliament is still called Tynwald, a direct descendant of the Norse word for the assembly field, and it still meets once a year in the open air on an ancient stepped mound, where the laws passed in the previous year are proclaimed aloud in both English and Manx before they take effect. It is the oldest continuously functioning parliament on earth, and it is, in its bones, a Viking institution. The end of Norse Dublin as an independent power is conventionally dated to the Great Battle of Clontarf in 1014, fought just outside the town on Good Friday, where the High King Brian Boru defeated a coalition of the Dublin Norse and their allies and was then killed in his own tent as the fighting ended. Later Irish writers made it a national epic of Ireland against the foreigner. In truth, both armies contained Norse and Irish alike. It was a struggle over the high kingship, and the Norse were one faction in it among several. In the autumn of 865, a fleet landed in East Anglia, and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle gave it a name that it gave to nothing else before or afterwards: the Great Heathen Army. The phrasing matters. This was not a summer raid and not a tribute-hunting expedition. It was a conquest, undertaken by men who did not intend to go home, and the English understood that almost immediately. England at that date was 4 kingdoms and had been for some time. Northumbria in the north, wealthy, cultured, and just then engaged in tearing itself apart in a civil war between 2 rival claimants. Mercia in the Midlands, the old dominant power, now past its best. East Anglia in the east, small and rich. And Wessex in the south, the youngest of the great powers and generally reckoned the least of them. Nobody in 865 would have picked Wessex to survive. The army's leaders were, according to later tradition, the sons of a half-legendary sea king the sagas call Ragnar Lothbrok, Hairy Breeches, and the stories say they came for vengeance, their father having been thrown into a pit of snakes by the king of Northumbria. The revenge tale is almost certainly a later literary invention, and Ragnar himself may be 3 or 4 different men stitched together. The brothers, however, were entirely real: Ivar, called the Boneless, Halfdan, and Ubba. They wintered in East Anglia, extracted horses as the price of peace, which tells you they intended to campaign inland, and in 866 rode north straight into the Northumbrian Civil War. In November they took York almost without a fight. When the 2 rival Northumbrian kings finally stopped fighting each other and combined to take it back the following spring, they broke into the city and were both killed in its streets. Northumbria as an independent kingdom ended there. York became the Norse city of Jorvik, and it did not merely survive. It boomed. Within a century, it was a manufacturing and trading town of perhaps 10,000 people, and its waterlogged soil at Coppergate has preserved its daily life in almost embarrassing detail. Leather boots and shoes, wooden bowls and cups, amber workshops, textile tools, coins, silk that had come from Central Asia, and the general damp, crowded, extremely smelly business of a busy medieval town. Mercia came next, then East Anglia again. In 869, the East Anglian king, Edmund, was defeated and killed. The stories that grew up afterwards said he had been tied to a tree and shot full of arrows for refusing to renounce his faith or share his kingdom with a heathen. Whatever the truth, he became England's first great royal martyr, and the town that grew around his shrine still carries his name, Berry Street, Edmonds. 3 of the 4 kingdoms had fallen in 5 years. In 871, the army turned south into Wessex, and Wessex, to everyone's surprise, including probably its own, fought back hard. There were 9 general engagements in that single year, some won and more lost. In the middle of it, the King of Wessex died, and was succeeded not by his young sons but, by agreement, by his youngest brother, a bookish, chronically ill young man of about 22 named Alfred. Alfred's first significant act as king was not glorious, and he never pretended otherwise. He bought peace. The army had not been beaten. It had merely been made to work considerably harder than it liked for what it was getting, and it accepted the silver and went off to easier ground in the north, while Wessex paid and rebuilt and waited for it to come back, which everybody knew it would. Over the next few years, the army did something far more historically decisive than any battle. It began to settle down. In 876, Halfdan shared out the land of Northumbria among his men, and the chronicle records, with no particular emphasis, that they proceeded to plow it and to support themselves. The following years saw the same thing happen in Mercia and in East Anglia, armies converting themselves, by agreement among their own members, into landowners. That is the moment the invasion turns into an immigration, and it is the most consequential thing in this whole section of the story. Thousands of Scandinavian men, and the place name and genetic evidence increasingly suggests a substantial number of Scandinavian women as well, took up land across the entire north and east of England, kept their own law and their own customs, and within 2 generations were simply the people who lived there. In January of 878, in the dead of winter, when by every convention of the age nobody campaigned at all, a Norse army under a leader named Guthrum came out of Gloucester and fell without warning on the royal estate at Chippenham. It was the Christmas season. The king was there with a small household. Wessex was not merely unprepared. It was demobilized, scattered across its shires and celebrating. The kingdom collapsed inside a month. A large part of the nobility submitted, and others fled overseas. And Alfred, the last king of the last independent English kingdom, escaped westward into the marshes of Somerset with a handful of men, to a patch of firm ground surrounded by swamp and reed and winter water, at a place called Athelney. He was, at that moment, a king of about 6 square miles of bog. This is where the most famous story about him belongs. The king in hiding, sheltering in the hut of a peasant woman who does not know who he is, so lost in his own thoughts that he lets her loaves burn black on the hearth, and is thoroughly scolded for it. It first appears in writing more than 100 years later and is almost certainly not true. It has survived for 1,000 years because it is exactly the right story for that particular spring. What actually happened at Athelney was patient, unromantic, and rather impressive. Alfred built a fortress in the marsh, where the water did his defending for him. He raided out of it through the late winter, taking supplies and keeping his men busy. And he sent messengers quietly and repeatedly to the shires that had not submitted, because what he was doing over those weeks was arranging by hand a rendezvous that had to be secret and had to be exact. In May, the fighting men of Somerset, Wiltshire, and part of Hampshire came to a stone at the edge of Selwood Forest, and there, the chronicle says in one of the very few emotional phrases in the whole document, they were glad to see him. 2 days later, he brought Guthrum to battle at Edington, formed the old shield wall, pushed it forward, and broke the Norse army in the field. And then he did something genuinely unusual. He pursued the survivors to their stronghold, besieged them for a fortnight until hunger did the rest, and when they surrendered, he did not put them to the sword. He required baptism. Guthrum was christened with Alfred himself standing as godfather, took the Christian name Athelstan, and was permitted to keep East Anglia and to rule it as a Christian king and as Alfred's godson. The treaty they eventually agreed drew a line across England, up the Thames, then along the River Lea to its source, then to Bedford, then along the Ouse to Watling Street. North and east of that line, Norse law and Norse custom applied, the region that would come to be called the Danelaw. South and west of it lay Alfred's England. For the first time since 865, the invasion had a boundary, and both sides had a reason to respect it. Alfred then used the years of peace exactly as a man who expects another war ought to. He built a network of fortified towns, baths right across Wessex, deliberately sited so that no place in the kingdom was more than about 20 miles from a defended refuge, and garrisoned each one by a rota of men drawn from a fixed acreage of surrounding land. The document that records the system, the Burghall-Heidage, is essentially a spreadsheet. He reorganized the army so that half of it was in the field while the other half was at home working its land. Then they swapped, which meant that for the first time Wessex could keep a force in being all year instead of watching its levies dissolve at harvest. He built larger ships, designed to his own specification to meet raiders at sea. And then he turned to the thing he believed had been damaged worse than any wall: learning. He complained, in a preface he wrote himself, that when he came to the throne there were very few men south of the Thames who could understand their own service books in English or translate a letter out of Latin, and that the ruined libraries stood full of books nobody could any longer read. So he learned Latin in middle age, translated the works he thought most necessary for men to know, and sent a copy to every bishopric in his kingdom. It is the only time in English history that a king personally did the translating. Now let us leave the armies for a while and go indoors, because the overwhelming majority of these people never raided anything in their lives, and their world is the part of the story that usually gets left out. If you had been born in 9th century Norway, the odds are very good that you would have died within sight of the house you were born in, and that nothing in this narrative would have involved you at all. Picture the house. Long and narrow, its walls built of turf or timber or wattle and daub depending on what the district had, its roof low and heavy and often turfed, so that from a distance a farm looks like a series of green mounds with smoke coming out of them, and sheep occasionally graze on the roof. Inside, there is one long room, dim and smoky and, crucially, warm. That last quality is what everything else has been sacrificed for. A fire trench runs down the middle of the floor, burning constantly, and the smoke drifts up and finds its way out through a hole in the ridge, eventually, after filling the upper third of the room. Along both side walls run raised earthen platforms, and these are the furniture. Benches by day, beds by night, storage underneath. The whole household, family, servants, thralls, guests, sleeps in a row along the walls with the fire in between. At one end, in many farms, the animals are housed behind a partition. Cattle and sometimes sheep brought in for the winter. It is unpleasant in obvious ways, and it is also extremely sensible because a dozen cattle generate a great deal of heat and nothing else in that landscape does. The smell of a northern farmhouse in February. Smoke, animals, wet wool, sour milk, fish oil, would be almost unbearable to us and was simply the smell of home. There are no chimneys and no glazed windows. Light comes from the fire, from the smoke hole, and from small soapstone lamps burning fish or seal oil with a wick of twisted moss. In midwinter, the working day happens almost entirely by firelight, which is exactly why so much of the winter's work is work that skilled hands can do without needing to see much. Spinning, carding, netting, rope-making, whittling, carving, and talking. The food was better than you might expect and duller than you would want. Barley and oats, as porridge and as flat, unleavened bread cooked on a griddle. Dairy in enormous quantity, milk, butter, whey, cheese, and a thick strained sour product very close to modern skyr, which keeps for months. Fish dried hard as a board or salted. Meat mostly in the autumn at the slaughter, when everything that could not be fed through the winter was killed, salted, and smoked at once. And ale constantly at every meal and for everyone. Ale was not a luxury or an indulgence. It was food, and it was safe storage, brewed weak, drunk by adults and children alike, carrying calories through the winter in a form that would not spoil. The great feasts in the sagas are measured in ale, and a chieftain who could not provide enough of it at the proper seasons had a political problem, not a social one. The household was a working economic unit, and its authority was divided in a way that genuinely mattered. The man's sphere was outside the threshold, the fields, the boat, the assembly, the feud. The woman's sphere was inside it, and inside it she was in command. She carried the keys to the chests and the storehouse on a ring at her belt, and those keys were a real symbol of office, worn in life and buried with women in death. Norse women held rights that most of Christian Europe would not extend to women for another 800 years. They could own property in their own name and inherit it. They could initiate divorce, and the sagas show them doing so publicly and effectively, sometimes for reasons that include a husband's failure to defend the household's honor. Their evidence carried legal weight. A widow ran the farm, and nobody thought it remarkable. And when the men were away, which in a raiding or trading community might be half the year, every year, the farm was simply run by women outright, including the decisions that had consequences. Could hardly be otherwise. A society that sends a third of its adult men over the horizon each spring is necessarily a society in which women exercise real, practical, daily authority, whatever its heroic poetry chooses to emphasize. Children were part of the working household almost as soon as they could walk, herding, fetching, carrying water, learning by imitation and by being shouted at. Toys have been found in the wet ground of Norse towns. Little carved wooden horses, small boats with holes for masts, miniature weapons. So have children's shoes, worn through at the toe in exactly the way that children's shoes have always worn through at the toe. And at the bottom of the household were the thralls. Slaves with no legal personality at all, doing the heaviest, coldest, and filthiest work. Grinding grain by hand, which was endless, cutting and carrying turf, spreading dung, tending fires. A thrall might be freed or by freedom, but a freedman and his descendants remained legally lesser for several generations. This was not a marginal or occasional institution. It was the floor that the entire house stood on. For a people with a reputation for lawlessness, the Norse were remarkably, almost obsessively preoccupied with law. They had no police, no prisons, no standing courts, and no state worth the name. What they had instead was the assembly and an intense interest in correct procedure. And the sagas are full of men who are admired not for how they fought but for how well they knew the rules. It was called the Thing. At fixed times of the year, the free men of a district came to a fixed place in the open air, a mound, a plain, a field beside a river, a place used for the purpose since before anybody could remember. And there they heard disputes, delivered judgments, agreed laws, witnessed sales and marriages and land transfers, and generally conducted the public business of a society with no offices in it. There was no judge in our sense and no executive power of any kind. Cases were argued in front of the assembled free men, who decided between them. And there is the fundamental weakness of the whole system. The Thing could pronounce a judgment, but it could not enforce one. Enforcement was left entirely to the successful party and his kinsmen, which meant that winning a case and getting what you had won were two quite different projects. Which is exactly why kinship mattered so much. A man alone had no protection whatsoever, however right he was. A man with numerous kinsmen, and a chieftain who valued him, was expensive to wrong and everybody could see it. Norse society ran on a constant, careful, universal calculation of who would have to be answered to, and a great deal of apparently touchy behavior is really the routine maintenance of that calculation. The great mechanism for keeping this from destroying everybody was compensation. Almost every injury had a price attached, the wergild, the man price, and the law code set them out with a butcher's precision. So much for a killing, so much for the loss of an eye, so much for a hand, less for a finger, and more in every case if the act had been done publicly or in a way that made the victim look ridiculous. Because insult mattered enormously, and it is easy to misread this as vanity. It was not. Honor was collateral. A man whose reputation could be damaged with impunity would very quickly find his goods taken, his boundaries moved and his claims ignored, because nobody would expect consequences. In a society without police, the obligation to answer an insult promptly and visibly was a form of self-defense, and everybody understood it as such. When compensation failed, there was feud, and the sagas are, above everything else, records of feud. A killing, a payment refused or offered insultingly, a killing in return, an arbitrated settlement, a settlement broken by somebody's cousin, and on it grinds through decades and generations until whole families are destroyed. The literature is completely clear-eyed about this. Feud is shown as a trap that intelligent, reasonable men walk into one entirely reasonable step at a time. The heaviest sentence an assembly could pass was not death. It had no way to carry out a death sentence. It was outlawry. Lesser outlawry meant 3 years abroad. Full outlawry meant that a man was placed outside the law altogether. He could not be fed, sheltered, transported, or helped by anybody, and he could be killed by anyone at all without penalty or compensation. In a northern winter, full outlawry was a death sentence with a longer timetable. There was also the duel, the home gang, the island-going, fought by formal agreement on marked ground, with rules about the number of shields permitted, the sequence of blows, and what counted as stepping outside the boundary. It was a legal instrument as much as a fight, a way of settling a claim the assembly could not resolve. Iceland eventually banned it outright because strong men had worked out that they could take other men's land by simply challenging them for it. What is most striking, standing back from all of it, is the sheer volume of talking. The saga hero who is genuinely admired is very often not the best fighter but the best lawyer. The man who wins by knowing procedure, by spotting the flaw in an opponent's summons, by quietly assembling support in the weeks before the assembly meets. To these people, a beautifully argued case was as admirable as a beautifully struck blow, and considerably safer. Around the year 870, ships began arriving on the coast of a large island in the North Atlantic which had, as far as anybody can tell, no human beings on it at all, with the possible exception of a few Irish hermits who had rowed out there in search of solitude some generations earlier, and who now discovered that they had not, in the long run, found it. Iceland is a peculiar country to try to settle. It is volcanic and geologically new, with glaciers and lava fields and hot springs and, at intervals, eruptions that darken the sky. It was better wooded then than now. The settlers cut and burned most of it within 2 centuries, but it has no grain that ripens reliably, no usable large timber, and no metal ore. What it does have is grass, and a great deal of coastline. And grass means cattle and sheep, and the island was empty. To a Norwegian family being squeezed by a consolidating king, or by a neighbor with more sons and more spears, empty was worth an enormous amount. Over a period of about 60 years, somewhere between 10 and 20,000 people crossed the open ocean in cargo ships with their animals and their tools and their seed corn and stayed. They did not all come directly from Norway. A striking proportion came by way of Ireland and the Scottish Isles, where Norse settlement was already a generation old, and modern genetics has confirmed what the sagas only hint at. The great majority of Icelandic men's paternal lines are Scandinavian. The majority of Icelandic women's maternal lines trace back to the British Isles. A very large number of those women did not travel by choice. Iceland then did something no other medieval European society did. It kept a detailed written record of its own founding. The Book of Settlements lists some 430 original settlers, where each came from, where he took his land, what the boundaries were, and who his descendants became. It is a nation that begins with an inventory, and it has been arguing about the details ever since with great enthusiasm. And in the year 930, the settlers made a decision without precedent anywhere in Europe. Rather than accept a king, most of them having left home precisely to get away from one, they created a national assembly, the Althing, which met for 2 weeks every summer at a place where a great fault in the earth's crust has thrown up a wall of black rock above a wide plain, with a natural acoustic and room for thousands. There, at Thingvellir, the law was recited aloud. One man was elected law speaker for 3 years at a time, and his single duty was to hold the entire legal code in his memory and to recite 1/3 of it each summer from the law rock in public, so that at the end of his term the whole of it had been spoken and nobody could claim they had not heard it. That was the Constitution. A man with an exceptional memory, speaking to a crowd. The assembly heard cases, made law, and served as the fixed point around which the rest of national life arranged itself. Marriages negotiated, trades concluded, alliances made, quarrels patched or sharpened. Around it grew the largest gathering of the year, a temporary town of turf-walled booths roofed with cloth, full of merchants and beer and gossip and courtship. For 2 weeks, a scattered rural population became a nation, and then it went home again. It was a republic of a strange and specific kind. No king, no army, no bureaucracy, no taxes, and no executive of any description. It was also unmistakably an oligarchy. Real power lay with the Gadar, the chieftain priests, and ordinary farmers attached themselves to one of them for protection and could in theory transfer their allegiance. But for very nearly 350 years, this arrangement governed an entire country without a crown. And out of that small, cold, poor, endlessly argumentative society came the body of literature that preserves almost everything we know about the Norse world from the inside. The sagas, written down in Iceland in the 13th century, 200 years and more after the events they describe, are prose narratives of astonishing quality. Spare, unsentimental, psychologically acute, structurally sophisticated, and frequently very funny in an extremely dry way. They are not history in our sense, and they cannot be used as though they were. They are family memory shaped into art by writers with agendas of their own. But without a few hundred Icelanders sitting in turf houses through very long winters, writing down what their great-grandparents were supposed to have said and done, the entire Viking age would be nothing but archaeology and the complaints of the monks they robbed. Among the settlers of Iceland was a man whose family had a certain talent for being asked to leave places. Erik Thorvaldsson had come to Iceland as a boy, not by choice, because his father had been outlawed from Norway for killings. In Iceland, on reaching adulthood, Erik proceeded to maintain the family tradition with some energy. He was outlawed from one district after a dispute over some borrowed benchboards escalated, as such disputes reliably did, into a number of dead men. He moved to another district, quarreled with his new neighbors, and killed again. Around the year 982, the assembly lost patience and sentenced him to 3 years of full outlawry, which meant he had to leave the country altogether or be killed by anyone who felt like it. So he sailed west. Land had been sighted out in that direction decades earlier by a ship blown badly off course, and Erik, having 3 years to fill and nowhere legal to be, went to look for it. He found a coast of ice, followed it south until it turned, came around the tip, and worked his way up the western side into a series of long, deep, sheltered fjords with genuine grass at their heads and no people anywhere. He spent his exile exploring and mapping it, and when his 3 years were up, he sailed back to Iceland and began what can only be described as a marketing campaign. He called the place Greenland because, as one saga says with complete and admirable frankness, men would be much more eager to go there if the land had an attractive name. It worked. In 985 or 986, a fleet of 25 ships set out from Iceland loaded with families, cattle, sheep, tools, seed, and iron. 14 arrived. The rest were lost or turned back. That ratio deserves to be sat with for a moment. To emigrate to Greenland was to accept, on the strength of the voyage alone, a serious and openly acknowledged chance of dying on the way. They founded 2 settlements on the southwestern coast, and against every reasonable expectation they lasted 450 years. At their height, perhaps 2,000 to 3,000 Norse lived there in stone and turf farms strung along the fjords, with churches, a cathedral at Gardar, a resident bishop sent out from Norway, a functioning assembly of their own, and regular if infrequent shipping to Iceland and beyond. It was never comfortable and never secure. Grain would not ripen at that latitude. Timber had to be imported or gathered as Siberian driftwood from the beaches. Iron was scarce enough that nails were reused. They lived on dairy from summer pasture, on seal, on caribou, on seabirds, and on a single export that Europe could not get anywhere else: walrus ivory, hunted far to the north each summer in a long, dangerous communal expedition. And then, across the 15th century, the Norse Greenlanders vanish from the record. There is no massacre and no single catastrophe. The climate cooled through what is called the Little Ice Age, shortening the growing season and thickening the sea ice. The ivory trade collapsed when African elephant ivory returned to European markets and made walrus tusk unfashionable. Ships from Norway came less often, and then rarely, and then not at all. The last written record of them is a wedding. 2 people were married at Valsey Church in 1408, and the fact was noted in a document filed afterwards in Iceland, the ordinary legal paperwork of an entirely ordinary marriage in a place that was about to cease existing. The church is still standing, roofless now, its stonework neat and square, looking out across the fjord exactly as it did that day. Why they died out is still argued. A cooling climate, soil erosion caused by their own overgrazing and turf cutting, the loss of the trade that paid for iron and timber, increasing isolation, conflict with the Thule Inuit who had moved south into the hunting grounds, and, this is the contested part, a possible cultural refusal to adopt the Inuit technologies of sealskin kayaks and ice hunting that would have let them live well where the Inuit thrived. Probably all of it slowly, over 3 or 4 generations of people watching their world get smaller. But before Greenland failed, it produced the single most remarkable voyage of the entire age. And it began, as these things very often do, with a man who got badly lost and had the sense to remember what he saw. Bjarni Herjolfsson sailed from Iceland intending to join his father in the new Greenland colony, was carried far off course by fog and northerly winds, and after days of blind sailing sighted a land that was low and forested and entirely the wrong shape. He did not land, he had a cargo and a destination. He corrected his course, found Greenland, and told people what he had seen. And he was criticized for it, the saga notes, on the grounds of insufficient curiosity. Some 15 years later, Erik the Red son Leif bought Bjarni's ship, specifically that ship, and went to look. He found 3 coasts and named each for what it was. A land of flat stones, then a land of forests, and finally, further south, a place of meadows and rivers thick with salmon, where the grass stayed green so late that he judged cattle would not need to be housed for the winter at all. He called it Vinland, the wine land, for the grapes or wild berries they found growing there. They built houses, wintered, cut a cargo of timber, which Greenland desperately needed, and sailed home rich and admired. Others followed. Leif's brother Thorvald, who was killed there by an arrow, and later a full colonizing expedition under Thorfinn Karlsefni, with livestock and women aboard, intending to stay permanently. For centuries all of this was regarded as legend, on a level with the voyages of St. Brendan. Then, in 1960, a Norwegian explorer and his archaeologist wife, following the sailing directions in the sagas and asking local fishermen whether there were any old ruins about, were taken to look at some odd grassy ridges near a fishing village at the northern tip of Newfoundland, at a place called Lance Aux Meadows. Excavation found 8 turf buildings of unmistakably Norse construction, laid out in the Icelandic manner. It found a smithy with iron slag and bog iron working, the first iron ever smelted in the Americas. It found a ring-headed bronze cloak pin, a bone needle, and a soapstone spindle whorl, which is decisive, because spinning was women's work and its presence means this was not simply a boatload of men. And it found butternuts. Butternuts do not grow anywhere near northern Newfoundland. Their natural range begins several hundred miles to the south, in the region of the St. Lawrence and New Brunswick, which is also where wild grapes grow. Somebody based at that camp had traveled a very long way further south, into precisely the kind of country the sagas describe, and had brought something back. So Lance Aux Meadows is not the colony itself. It is a base camp, a ship repair station and staging post for expeditions going further, occupied for perhaps 10 or 20 years around the year 1000 and then deliberately abandoned, its buildings emptied of anything worth carrying. But it settles the central question absolutely and permanently. Europeans reached America, built houses there, and worked iron there 500 years before Columbus was born. So why did it fail? The sagas are unusually honest about it. The land was good. Everybody agrees the land was good. The problem was the people already living in it. The Norse called them skrælings, a contemptuous word, and after a period of cautious and profitable trading, red cloth for furs, and there is a lovely detail about the Norse cutting the cloth into ever narrower strips as demand rose. Relations broke down into killing on both sides. And the arithmetic was hopeless from the start. The Greenland colony had at most 2,000 or 3,000 people in total, at the end of a supply line running back through Iceland to Norway, several weeks of dangerous sailing away. It could put perhaps 100 people ashore in Vinland at any one time. Against a resident population that knew the country intimately and was not going anywhere, 100 people cannot hold ground for long. So they left. Not defeated in any dramatic or memorable way, simply outnumbered, too far from home, and unable to justify the losses to the families who had funded the ships. The voyages continued for a while as timber runs to the Labrador coast, mentioned almost in passing in Icelandic annals as late as 1347, and then even those stopped and the knowledge became a story, and the story became a legend. It is one of history's great near misses, and it is a good thing to drift off thinking about. That for a few decades around the year 1000 there were Norse families living on the coast of North America, cutting hay, mending a hull, milking cows, watching the tree line for movement, and then the ships went home and the meadows grew over and the world waited another 500 years to try again. While the Norwegians went west, the Swedes went east, and their half of the story is much less famous and arguably had far larger consequences. It produced no sagas and very little poetry, but it produced two countries. The Baltic was their doorstep, and just beyond it lay something extraordinary. An immense, flat, forested plain threaded by some of the largest river systems on Earth, all of them running south. The Fokhof and the Dnieper toward the Black Sea, the Volga toward the Caspian. If a man could get from one river system to the next, he could travel from the Baltic to Constantinople or to the markets of the Caliphate entirely by water except for the gaps. Crossing the gaps was the hard part, and the answer was the portage. Unloading the boats and hauling them bodily overland on rollers or by dragging, sometimes for several miles, between the headwaters of one river and the next, then reloading and going on. Which is exactly why their light, shallow, flexible ships mattered so much. No Mediterranean vessel, and no later medieval ship of any size, could have been dragged across a watershed by its own crew. The Slavic and Finnic peoples of those forests called these newcomers the Russ, a word that most probably derives from an Old Norse term for the men who row. Their trading posts grew into towns, Starya first near the Baltic end, then Novgorod on the northern rivers, and finally Kyiv on the middle Dnieper, sitting on the bluffs above the river, which became the center of the whole enterprise. The Russian primary chronicle, compiled centuries afterwards, tells a founding story in which the local peoples, exhausted by their own endless quarrels, sent across the sea to invite a Russ leader named Rurik to come and rule them, because there was no order among them. Historians treat this as a legend constructed to legitimize a dynasty. But Scandinavian names, Scandinavian graves, and Scandinavian goods are all over the earliest layers of these towns, and the argument is only about proportion. What emerged was Kievan Rus, a genuine state ruled by a dynasty with unmistakably Norse names which, within 3 generations, had become entirely Slavic in language and outlook. Helgi became Oleg, Ingvar became Igor. Valdemar became Vladimir. The rulers were absorbed by the far more numerous people they ruled, thoroughly and quickly, and after about a century the Scandinavian element survives mainly in names and in a few burial customs. Their commerce was formidable and grim in equal measure. Furs by the tens of thousands, wax, honey, amber, and slaves, taken in raids on the forest peoples and marched down to the river markets in coffles. Arab writers describe the Rus arriving at the Volga trading stations with boatloads of captives and a great deal of confidence, and describe them with a mixture of genuine admiration and open disgust. The Arab diplomat Ibn Fadlan, who encountered them on the Volga in 922, left the most vivid description of any Norse people written by an outsider who actually met them. He thought them the most perfect physical specimens he had ever seen. Tall, ruddy, blonde, and tattooed from fingernail to neck with dark green patterns, and noted that every single man carried an axe, a sword and a broad knife at all times, and never put them down. He also considered them the filthiest of God's creatures, and described with real horror their morning washing routine, in which a servant carried round a single basin and each man in turn washed his face and hair and blew his nose into it before passing it on. This tells us as much about the standards of Baghdad as about the Rus. In Northern Europe, the Norse actually had a reputation for excessive grooming, and combs are among the most common objects in their graves. In 988, Prince Vladimir of Kyiv chose Christianity, and the Chronicles account of how he chose it is famous. Envoys sent to sample the world's religions, reporting that in the Greek church they did not know whether they were in heaven or on earth. Islam was rejected in part, the Chronicle says, because drinking is the joy of the Rus and they cannot do without it. Vladimir was baptized, married the Byzantine emperor's sister, and had the idols of the old gods dragged down and thrown into the Dnieper. And with that, the Eastern Norse story ends by turning into something else entirely. Their descendants were Orthodox Slavic princes of a large and increasingly sophisticated realm, and the Scandinavian thread simply disappears into the beginnings of Russia and Ukraine, leaving behind a dynasty's personal names, a scattering of graves full of northern brooches, and, quite probably, the name of a country. Follow the Dnieper far enough south, past the 7 great rapids where every boat had to be unloaded and carried and where the Pecheneg nomads waited in the rocks precisely because they knew it, and you came out at last into the Black Sea. And across that sea, on the strait between 2 continents, stood the greatest city in the world. Constantinople. The Norse called it Miklagard, the Great City, and for men from a country of turf houses and timber halls it must have been very close to incomprehensible. 12 miles of triple land walls, several 100,000 people, aqueducts and cisterns and public baths, streets of silk merchants, and above it all the vast shallow dome of Hagia Sophia, which is built on a ring of windows so that it appears to float on light. They came at it first in the way they came at everything. In 860 a Rus fleet appeared without any warning in the Bosphorus while the emperor was away campaigning, and spent weeks ravaging the suburbs and the islands in the Sea of Marmara. The walls held, as they always did. The raiders left, heavily laden. And then they came back at intervals for the next 200 years with steadily diminishing success. And after each attack came the thing that mattered far more, a treaty. The Byzantines were extremely skilled at converting enemies into assets, and the surviving treaties with the Rus are detailed commercial documents, specifying which gate the northern merchants could enter by, how many at a time, where they were to be housed outside the walls, how long they could stay, and what they were permitted to buy and to sell. So a trade route ran from the Baltic to the Bosphorus, and it ran hard in both directions. Byzantine silk turns up in Scandinavian graves. Arab silver turns up in Swedish soil in almost unbelievable quantities. More Islamic dirhams have been excavated on the single Baltic island of Gotland than in most countries of the Middle East. A farm in Sweden could be paid for with coins minted in Samarkand. And then, in 988, the relationship reached its remarkable conclusion. The Emperor Basil II, facing a dangerous revolt by his own generals and unable to trust the armies of his own aristocracy, asked Vladimir of Kyiv for troops. Vladimir sent 6,000 Norse warriors, probably as much to get them out of his own territory as to help, and Basil used them to destroy the rebellion and then decided to keep them permanently. They became the Varangian Guard, the emperor's personal bodyguard, composed of foreigners with no Byzantine families, no local factions and no stake in the endless conspiracies of the court, loyal, therefore, to whoever was actually wearing the purple. They stood beside the throne with long two-handed axes over their shoulders, and Byzantine writers refer to them, with genuine respect, as the emperor's axe-bearing barbarians. The pay was extraordinary, and the informal benefits were better. On the death of an emperor, the guard held a customary right to walk through the imperial treasury and take away as much as each man could carry, a privilege that must have made imperial funerals unusually well attended. Men went home to Sweden rich enough to live as minor kings, and a considerable number of Swedish runestones commemorate sons and brothers who died in Greece. The most famous Varangian of all served there in the 1030s. An exiled Norwegian prince named Harald Sigurdsson, half-brother of a dead king, who had arrived as a penniless refugee at about 18. He fought for the empire in Sicily, in Bulgaria and in the Holy Land, rose to command, accumulated an immense private fortune which he shipped north for safekeeping, and eventually went home to buy and fight his way to the throne of Norway. We will meet him again at the end of this story. And somewhere in that enormous city, on the marble parapet of the upper south gallery of Hagia Sophia, during some interminable service, a bored guardsman took out his knife and carved his name into the stone. Most of it has worn away over 10 centuries. What can still be made out reads, as far as anyone can determine, Halfdan carved these runes. He is still there, in the greatest church in Christendom, having been told not to fidget. It is worth stopping here to look at the whole system at once, because when you lay it out on a map, the Viking Age stops looking like a series of raids and starts looking like something rather different. The first commercial network to link the Atlantic, the Baltic, the Caspian, and the Mediterranean under a single set of hands, run by people with no state, no banks, and no writing. At the western end were the towns, and the greatest of them was Hedeby, at the narrow neck of the Danish peninsula, where goods were carried the short distance overland between the North Sea and the Baltic to avoid the long and genuinely dangerous sail around the top of Denmark. It held perhaps 1,500 people behind an enormous semicircular earth rampart, and for 2 centuries it was one of the busiest places in northern Europe. And there was Birka, its eastern counterpart, on a small island in a Swedish lake connected by water to the Baltic, a town of workshops and warehouses with a harbor of wooden jetties, a garrison on the rock above it, and cemeteries containing thousands of graves whose contents come from 4,000 miles away in every direction. Silk from China, glass from the Rhineland, coins from Baghdad, all of it in the ground of a small Swedish island. What moved along these roads? Out of the north came furs above everything. Marten, fox, beaver, and squirrel by the literal tens of thousands, bundled in standard counts. Also walrus ivory, walrus hide rope, which was the strongest cordage available anywhere in the world and which every navy wanted. Amber, hunting falcons, which were worth extraordinary sums. Whetstones, soapstone bowls, dried fish, iron blooms, and human beings. And into the north came silver more than anything else, Islamic dirhams by the hundreds of thousands, and later German and English coin. Also silk, both as whole cloth and as narrow trimming strips that a wealthy farmer could sew onto a good coat. Glass beads and glass vessels, wine, spices, superb Frankish sword blades, exported despite repeated bans, and small luxuries whose entire function was to demonstrate that their owner had connections. Money worked differently there, and this is worth understanding because it explains a great deal. For most of the age, the Norse did not count coins. They weighed silver. Coins were cut into fragments, ingots were chopped, jewelry was hacked apart. Hack silver, it is called, and the pieces were weighed on small folding balances with sets of graded weights that turn up constantly in graves. Value was purity and mass. Whose face was on it did not matter at all. Which explains the hoards. Across Scandinavia, the British Isles and the Baltic, thousands of caches of silver have been dug out of fields, floors, riverbanks, and boundary walls. Some were savings, buried because there was nowhere else to put wealth. Some were payments hidden hastily in an emergency. Some were probably offerings, deposited with no intention of retrieval. All of them are, at minimum, money that somebody buried and then did not come back for. The greatest of them all is the Cordale hoard, found in a Lancashire riverbank in 1840 by workmen repairing an embankment, who scooped it up in their caps before the bailiff arrived. Some 8,500 items, about 40 kilograms of silver, coins from Northumbria, Wessex, Frankia, Byzantium, the Islamic world, and Viking York, buried around the year 905, most likely by somebody connected with the Norse expelled from Dublin in 902. Nobody knows whose it was or why they never returned. And the great flow of Eastern silver has a strange, precise, and rather sudden ending. Around the 960s, the Islamic mints ran short of silver, the mines were exhausted, the political situation deteriorated, and the dirhams stopped arriving in the north. You can see it in the archaeology as clearly as a line ruled across a page. The economic engine that had helped start the Viking Age simply ran out of fuel. After that, Scandinavian raiding turns sharply toward a single target, which is England, and it changes character again. Less plunder, more extortion. Enormous, systematic, negotiated payments of silver were demanded from the English crown by fleets that arrived specifically in order to be paid to leave. The English called it the Danegeld, and they paid it repeatedly, in tens of thousands of pounds of coin raised by taxing every hide of land in the kingdom. The scale of that transfer is still legible in the ground today, and it is genuinely startling. So much English silver was carried north in those decades that English coins of the late 10th and early 11th centuries are found more abundantly in Scandinavian soil than in English soil. An entire kingdom's money supply picked itself up and migrated across the North Sea, one payment at a time. Because of the way they buried their dead, we know these people far more intimately than we know most of medieval Europe. Christian burial gives the archaeologist a body in a shroud, aligned east to west with nothing else. Norse burial, before the conversion, gives the archaeologist an entire household, laid out in order, with the tools of a life arranged around a person. They believed that what went into the ground went with you, so the graves contain the equipment of an existence. Weapons and horses and riding gear for some, brooches, beads, keys, spindle whorls, weaving swords and shears for others, and for both the small ordinary things that make the point most sharply, a comb, a knife, a cooking pot, a set of gaming pieces with the board laid out ready so that whatever came next would not be dull. Sometimes the grave was a boat. A small vessel dragged up from the shore and buried whole with its owner inside it. Or, where wood was too precious to bury, the outline of a ship laid out on a hillside in standing stones, prow pointing toward the water. To go into the earth in a ship was the most eloquent statement this culture was capable of making about death. It said, unmistakably, this is not an ending, it is a departure. And twice, in Norway, they buried a ship so large and so complete that the blue clay of the mound preserved it almost entire. The Oseberg ship was raised in 1904, 70 feet of oak, its prow and stern carved from end to end with an interlace of gripping beasts so fine and so controlled that it looks less like woodwork than like metal. And inside it, laid on a bed in a timber chamber, were two women. One was in her 80s and one in her 50s, buried around the year 834 with a wagon, for ornamented sleds, 15 horses, 6 dogs, 2 cows, beds, chests, looms with weaving still on them, tapestries, kitchen equipment, and a wooden bucket containing wild apples. Who they were is unknown and probably unknowable. One of them was somebody of enormous consequence, and the other one went with her, and we cannot say which was which. The other great ship from Gokstad held a big man in his 40s who had plainly been in serious fighting. His bones show cuts that were never treated, and it is the more seaworthy of the two vessels. A full-sized replica was sailed across the Atlantic to Chicago in 1893, in 4 weeks in heavy weather, and its captain reported that the hull's flexing was alarming to watch and clearly the reason it survived. That ended the argument about whether such ships could cross oceans. The most disturbing account of a Norse funeral was written by an outsider. Ibn Fadlan watched the cremation of a Rus chieftain on the Volga in 922 and recorded what he saw with the awful precision of a man who could not make himself look away and who understood he was witnessing something he would never see again. The dead man was placed in a temporary grave for 10 days while his grave clothes were sewn and his goods assembled. A slave girl volunteered, that is his word, to accompany him. For those 10 days she was attended by others, given drink, treated as an honored person, and she sang. Ibn Fadlan notes that she seemed cheerful, and he notes it in a way that suggests he did not entirely believe it. Then the ship was hauled up on shore and set on a wooden frame. The body was placed inside a tent aboard it, dressed in brocade, with weapons and food and fruit, and animals were slaughtered and thrown in. The girl was lifted 3 times above a door frame to look over it into the next world, and each time she reported what she saw, her kinsman, and then her master calling her to come. Then she was taken into the tent and killed by an old woman whom the Russ called the Angel of Death, and the ship was fired. And one of the Russ, seeing the Arabs standing there watching, said something through an interpreter that Ibn Fadlan wrote down, and that has been quoted ever since. "You Arabs," he said, "are stupid. You take the man you love most in the world and you put him in the ground, where the insects and the worms eat him. We burn him in an instant so that he enters paradise at once, without waiting." It is a horrifying document and an honest one, and it should not be softened on the way past. Whatever else the great ship burials are, and they are among the most beautiful things the medieval world produced, and the Oseberg carving is genuinely one of the high points of European art. Some of them are also the graves of murdered people whose names nobody thought to write down. Now back to Frankia, where the raids had never really stopped, and where a beleaguered king was about to try a solution whose consequences would still be reshaping Europe 200 years later. The Seine Valley had been raided on and off for the better part of a century. Fleets had wintered on its islands, taken Rouen repeatedly, and besieged Paris itself in 885 with a force the chroniclers optimistically put at 700 ships. The Frankish Empire had fragmented after Charlemagne into quarreling kingdoms. Its defenses were local, inconsistent, and slow, and by 900 large parts of the lower Seine were effectively under Norse control anyway. So in 911, King Charles the Simple made a bargain with a Norse leader whom the Franks called Rollo. He would grant him the land around the mouth of the Seine, formally, permanently as a legitimate holding under the crown, on condition that Rollo accept baptism, do homage for the territory, and defend the river against every other Norseman who came up it. Which, being now a landowner, he had every reason to do thoroughly. It was precisely the same instinct that had produced Alfred's treaty with Guthrum 30 years earlier. If you cannot remove them, legalize them and give them a job. The territory became known for the men who held it, the land of the Northmen, Normandy, and Rollo's direct descendants would rule it in an unbroken line for 300 years. And the assimilation was total and astonishingly fast. Within 2 generations, the ruling family spoke French, endowed monasteries, patronized churchmen, and married into the French aristocracy. Within 4, hardly anybody in Normandy spoke Norse at all except in a few coastal pockets. What survived the language change was not culture but temperament. Mobile, acquisitive, aggressive, and extraordinarily good at organization and at building things in stone. And those Normans then did something that ordinary duchies do not do. Younger sons with no inheritance, the same old northern problem, transplanted into a new country and a new century, went south as mercenaries to fight in the endless wars of southern Italy, and within 50 years had taken southern Italy from the Byzantines and Sicily from its Muslim rulers, and founded a kingdom of their own there that became one of the richest in Europe. Others went on the First Crusade and carved out a principality at Antioch that lasted 170 years. Others fought in Spain and in the Byzantine armies, and, in a neat and rather satisfying historical loop, in the Varangian Guard itself, alongside and sometimes against the Scandinavians whose great-grandfathers they had been. And in 1066 the 7th Duke of Normandy, William, great-great-great-grandson of Rollo, crossed the Channel and took England, and then reorganized its aristocracy, its church, its architecture, its landholding and its language so comprehensively that the country has never entirely recovered. Within 20 years, almost every significant landowner in England was French-speaking, and English itself began the long process of becoming half a Romance language, which produces one of the great ironies of the whole age, and it is worth savoring. England spent 200 years resisting invasion from Scandinavia and paid enormous sums to buy it off and finally beat it in the field. And then it was conquered permanently, and in a way that changed absolutely everything, by the descendants of Scandinavians who had been handed a piece of France a century and a half earlier in order to keep them quiet. The Second Great Wave broke over England at the end of the 10th century, and this time it was not warbands under adventurers. It was kings with royal fleets, professional troops, and a strategy, and behind them a Danish state that had grown, in 150 years, into something capable of planning a conquest. England was rich, well organized, and under King Athelred it was very badly led. The chronicle of his long reign reads as a single exhausted recitation. Armies raised too late, fleets that never sailed, tribute paid too quickly, and commanders who did not fight or who changed sides. He is remembered by a nickname that has been mistranslated for 1,000 years. Unread does not mean unready, it means ill-advised, and it is a pun on his name, which means noble counsel. In 1002, in a decision that reads as pure panic even at a distance of 1,000 years, Athelred ordered the killing of Danish men living in England on the grounds of a rumored plot. What happened at Oxford, where a group took sanctuary in St. Brice's church and the townspeople burned the church down around them, stopped being merely a chronicle entry in 2008, when archaeologists excavating an Oxford college found a mass grave of young men, killed violently, of Scandinavian origin. The Danish king Sweyn Forkbeard invaded and kept invading, and in 1013 he simply took the country outright. Athelred fled to Normandy to his wife's family. Sweyn then died within weeks of his triumph. His son took up the war, and after 3 more years of hard campaigning and the death in battle of Ethelred's formidable son Edmund Ironside, the whole of England belonged to a Dane of about 20 named Cnut. What Cnut did next was not what anybody expected. He began conventionally enough with the execution or exile of the surviving English claimants and the men he could not trust. And then he stopped and simply governed, keeping English law, confirming English bishops, appointing Englishmen alongside Danes, marrying Ethelred's widow Emma, and issuing law codes that are among the most careful and most Christian documents of the entire age. By inheritance from his brother and by further campaigning, he came to rule England, Denmark, and Norway together, an empire arranged around the North Sea, governed largely from England because England was by far the richest part of it, with the sea functioning as its main highway rather than its frontier. For roughly 20 years, the North Sea was, in practical terms, a single political space with one man at the top of it. He went to Rome in 1027 for the imperial coronation and wrote home to his English subjects about the trip, a letter which survives, explaining, among other things, that he had used the occasion to negotiate reduced tolls and better protection for English and Danish merchants and pilgrims crossing the Alps. A Viking king lobbying two emperors about trade tariffs is as good a marker as any of how far the world had traveled in 200 years. The famous story about him belongs here, and it is almost always told backwards. Cnut had his throne carried down to the shore and commanded the incoming tide to stop, and the tide did not stop, and it wet his feet. But the point of the story, as the chronicler who first tells it makes explicit, is that Cnut was not deluded at all. He was rebuking his flattering courtiers, and he did it in order to demonstrate that the power of kings is empty beside the power that governs the sea and the land. His North Sea Empire did not survive him by long, because it depended entirely on one competent man. He died in 1035, at about 40. His two sons ruled briefly and unimpressively and were dead within 7 years, and by 1042 the English throne had passed back to the old West Saxon line in the person of Edward the Confessor, pious, cautious, childless, raised in Normandy among Normans, and destined to leave behind him the single most disputed succession in English history. Meanwhile, quietly and at home, the thing that would actually end the Viking Age, more surely than any battle, any fortified bridge or any English army, had already begun. Scandinavia was becoming Christian. It did not happen by preaching alone, and the missionaries had a discouraging time of it. Ansgar, the apostle of the north, made repeated journeys to Hedeby and Birka in the 9th century, built a couple of churches, made a handful of converts, and watched most of it evaporate the moment he left. What actually converted Scandinavia was the decision of kings, taken for reasons that were at least as political as they were spiritual. Because a Christian king could deal with Christian Europe as an equal, marry into its dynasties, and import its single most useful technology, not the cross but the administration that came attached to it. Writing, records, land surveys, charters, and a church hierarchy that taught, as a matter of doctrine, obedience to anointed authority. The old religion had no organization whatsoever to offer a king. The new one was, among other things, an instrument of government. In Denmark, Harold Bluetooth raised a great carved runestone at Jelling beside his parents' burial mounds, with a figure of Christ on one face, and had it declared on the stone that he had won for himself all Denmark and Norway and made the Danes Christian. It is a monument, a territorial claim, and a press release all at once, and it is sometimes called Denmark's birth certificate. It is still standing there under glass now in the churchyard. In Norway it was violent. Olaf Tryggvason and then Olaf Haraldsson pushed conversion by force, district by district, offering baptism, and where it was refused, using torture, mutilation, hostages, and execution, and destroying the temples and the idols. The second Olaf was eventually driven out by his own nobles, who had had enough, and was killed at Stiklestad in 1030 attempting to return. Within a year, miracles were reported at his grave. Within a generation he was Saint Olaf, the eternal king of Norway. Iceland, entirely characteristically, converted by committee. In the year 1000, the country was dividing dangerously between Christians and heathens, with both parties arming and each declaring itself out of the other's law. So both sides agreed to submit the question to the law speaker, Thorgir, who was himself a heathen priest, and to abide by whatever he decided. He lay down under a cloak for a day and a night, and did not speak and thought about it. Then he rose and gave his ruling. All Icelanders would be baptized, he said, because a people that lives under two laws will not keep the peace, and if the law is broken, the peace is broken. But private sacrifice would be permitted, along with the eating of horseflesh and the exposure of unwanted infants, concessions which were quietly dropped a few years later. A nation changed religion by a legal decision and then went home. Thorgir, the story goes, threw his own idols into a waterfall on the way. And with Christianity came the end of the Viking Age's essential internal logic. You cannot raid monasteries when your own king is endowing monasteries and your bishop is his cousin. Taking slaves from Christian populations became progressively unacceptable and then illegal, and slavery in Scandinavia faded away across the following 2 centuries. The dead were buried in churchyards in shrouds with nothing at all, and the archaeological record, which has told us so much, goes abruptly and permanently quiet. What survived was underneath. The gods became characters in stories, written down affectionately 300 years later by Christian Icelanders who could not bear to let them go, and who framed them as history rather than religion in order to keep them. Thor's hammers and Christian crosses were sometimes cast in the same soapstone mold, by the same smith, for different customers. And 4 of our 7 weekday names in English still quietly belong to TIW, Woden, Thuner, and Frige. Which brings us to the end, and to a single year that England has never quite finished arguing about. Edward the Confessor died in January 1066 without a child, and 3 men claimed his throne. Harold Godwin's son, the most powerful earl in England and the late king's brother-in-law, who was crowned within a day of the funeral. William, Duke of Normandy, who claimed Edward had promised him the succession years earlier and that Harold had sworn to support it. And Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, the same Harold who had served in the Varangian Guard 30 years before, and who now, at about 50, made one last claim on one last kingdom. Harold came in September with perhaps 300 ships, joined by Harold Godwinson's own exiled and embittered brother Tostig. They sailed up the Humber and the Ouse, defeated the northern earls in a hard fight at Fulford, and took York. And Harold Godwin's son, who had spent the entire summer waiting on the south coast for a Norman invasion that the wind would not permit, turned his army round and marched it north, about 180 miles in 4 days. He arrived at Stamford Bridge on the 25th of September so fast, and so completely unexpected, that the Norwegians were sitting in warm weather waiting for hostages to be delivered, with a large part of their armor left behind at the ships 7 miles away. There is a story, added to the chronicle much later, of one enormous Norseman holding the narrow bridge alone against the entire English army until somebody floated underneath in a barrel and speared him from below. The battle destroyed the Norwegian army completely. Harald Hardrada, Varangian mercenary, poet, king, the most traveled man of his century, was killed by an arrow through the throat early in the fighting, and Tostig was killed later in the day. The invaders who had come in 300 ships were permitted to go home in 24, because that was all the men they had left to sail them. It is usually called the end of the Viking Age, and for once the tidy date is roughly fair. 3 days later, the wind in the channel changed. William landed at Pevensey with an army and a great many horses, and began systematically burning the countryside of Harold's own earldom in order to force him to come south quickly. Harold marched his exhausted army back down the length of England, gathered what he could on the way, and on the 14th of October stood on a ridge outside Hastings and fought all day. And at dusk the last Anglo-Saxon king of England was killed, and the kingdom was lost to the great-great-great-grandsons of Vikings, thereby ending the Viking Age with a Norse victory that absolutely nobody at the time would have described in those terms. The men who won at Hastings spoke French, fought on horseback, and would have been genuinely insulted to be called Northmen. Their ancestors would not have recognized them at all. So what remained when the ships stopped coming? Words remained, and far more of them than you would ever guess. When you say sky or knife or egg or skin or leg or window, which is the wind-eye or husband or law or anger or ugly or happy or die, you are speaking Old Norse. Even the pronouns they, them, and there are borrowed Norse, taken into English because for 2 centuries the two languages were being spoken in the same villages by people who needed to understand each other. Places remained in their hundreds. Every English town whose name ends in by was a Norse farmstead. Grimsby, Whitby, Derby, Selby. Every thorp was an outlying secondary settlement. Every thwaite was a clearing hacked out of woodland. And every fell and beck and gill and tarn and dale in the north of England is a piece of Old Norse landscape vocabulary that people still use daily without any idea that they are doing it. Countries remained. Normandy, and through Normandy the entire aristocracy of England and a good deal of the aristocracy of southern Italy and Sicily. Russia and Ukraine through the Rus and their river towns. Iceland, entire and continuous, still speaking a language conservative enough that its school children can read the medieval sagas without translation. The Faroes, and Orkney and Shetland, which remained Norwegian until the 15th century and are not, even now, entirely persuaded that they are not. And blood remained quietly in a substantial fraction of the people around the North Atlantic, carried west by men in ships, and carried just as much by the women of Ireland and Scotland and the Isles who were taken aboard those ships against their will, and whose maternal lines now fill the genetic record of Iceland. The Viking Age is in a great many people who have never thought about it. And most of all the stories remained because a few hundred people in turf houses on a cold island decided that the past was worth the enormous labor of writing down. The sagas, the poems, the myths of the tree and the wolf and the 3 women at the well and the last morning of the world. It is the fullest surviving record of what pre-Christian Northern Europe actually thought about anything, and it survives essentially by accident at the edge of the map. It is worth resisting both of the easy pictures as you drift off. They were not the horned barbarians of the old paintings. No Viking ever wore a horned helmet, and the horns were put on them in the 19th century by an opera costume designer. But nor were they misunderstood merchants who have been unfairly maligned by their victims. They burned monasteries and sold children into slavery, and they also made poetry of great delicacy and sailed further than anyone else alive. Both of those things are true at the same time, and neither one cancels the other out, and that is simply what people are, then and now and probably always. And the end, when it came, was not a battle at all. It was much smaller and much quieter than that. It was a farmer somewhere on a Norwegian fjord in about the year 1100, whose grandfather had gone west every summer and come back with silver, and who now paid a tithe to a bishop, and had buried his father in a churchyard with nothing in the grave at all, and who kept the family boat for fishing. The ships were still there after all. They were carrying salt fish and timber and butter now instead of armed men, and the workshops along the fjords went on building them in exactly the same way. Keel, then planks, riveted and overlapped, caulked with tarred wool, for another 800 years because nobody ever found a better way to build a boat for that water. The sea did not change either. It is the same cold water it always was, moving under the same moon, along the same coast where the mountains go straight down into it and the light in summer never quite leaves the sky. If you stood on that shore tonight, in the dark, you would hear exactly what they heard, which was mostly nothing. And that is the whole story of the Northmen. 3 centuries, from a summer morning on an English beach to a Norwegian king dying in an English field with an arrow in his throat. Raiders and farmers, poets and slavers, lawyers, navigators, settlers, mercenaries, and at the last simply Europeans, absorbed without much noise into the world they had spent 300 years frightening. Sleep now. The fire is low, the tide is going out, and there is nothing at all on the water.